Thanks for that. Hi, Al.
Thank you. How are you, Shelisa?
I'm good. How are you?
It was good to see you.
It's good to see you, and it's good to see all of you. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Shelisa Demuth, the Executive Director at Beta and Twin Cities Startup Week and Tech.mn, and this is
Al Cornish, General Partner at Generator.
So Al, we're just getting to know each other really
Yes.
this year as I've stepped back into this ecosystem. You're doing incredible things at Generator, which is an accelerator, a regional accelerator.
Yeah.
Can you tell the folks here a little bit more about the impact of Generator and what you're doing?
Sure. For those of you who are not familiar, so Generator is an accelerator and venture capital fund that seeks to connect startups with investors and a host of other individuals in the ecosystem. Generator has worked with over 930 companies that have gone on to gain about $1 billion in follow-on financing. We're in 41 unique communities across the country and one international location, actually Luxembourg. Our mission is to be the vessel by which communities can invest in their best and brightest. So that's something that really resonates with me with equity and as we talk about how we can improve our startup ecosystem.
That's incredible,
Yeah.
really important work. I didn't even understand the full scope, so that's new information, is how Generator is
Now,
expanded.
can you tell me a little bit about yourself and Beta?
Yes, absolutely. So Beta is a 501c3 that's headquartered here in Minneapolis, and we serve the Minnesota startup ecosystem to deliver resources, provide relationships, provide education through an accelerator program similar to Generators, an accelerator program that really delivers on all of the things that a founder would need here to not only survive but thrive. So our mission is to create the next Fortune 500 companies out of the Minnesota startup ecosystem. Recently, we acquired Tech.mn, which is a media company that's focused on Minnesota tech, and so that's another part of our brand. And then, of course, we're the organizers of Twin Cities Startup Week. So that's really the impact that we're focused on, is awareness, and that's what this year has been focused on for us, is how do we raise awareness of all of the great programs. Connie Rutledge is sitting in the audience today at Wave Connie. Connie runs this place, Finnovation Lab, that's focused on social impact founders and entrepreneurs. She's got an accelerator program. And so directing founders to the resources that they need in the ecosystem is what we're focused on, both through Startup Week and through Beta. So to date, we've got 236 companies in our portfolio over a 9-year history. And we take a look at, of course, the way that funds are being raised. We've got a few programs for access to capital, and that's some of what we want to get into today. So when we look at the impact of our programs, and then, of course, the impact of our leadership, as we both chose this ecosystem, let's talk a little bit about your journey into this ecosystem regionally, why you choose to build here.
Yeah, I have a long and windy road, and I won't go through it all. My resume, I feel like, could be like 10 pages, right? But I actually started my career here in the Twin Cities at a medical devices company. So I think that gave me some early exposure to the corporate community, but the same medical devices company, you would hear while walking through the halls about how it started in the garage of Earl Bakken in Fridley as a startup. So I think that started to condition me to really think about the innovation ecosystem and how important that is to Minnesota. I left, did some other things, and came back and worked at another company, a retailer, and so another Minnesota company. So I had a theme of working with Minnesota companies, right? And so that became really an important part of my journey. And throughout that entire time, I served as a fractional CFO of a startup. So became really interested in the startup scene and seeing how startups can really provide that pipeline of innovation for corporations. That became something I became very interested in. So given that background and some of the things I had done in the community, I connected with Generator. I actually went to law school with Troy Vossler, who is one of the co-founders of Generator. And so about a year and a half ago, he reached out. He had done some work here in Minnesota and said, hey, given all the things that have happened in Minnesota, we really want to make an impact here. And we'd really like you to come on and lead some efforts. And so that's how I came to Generator. It's been a great journey. When I started, Generator I think I was employee 62. And now we're at 140 plus employees, so rapid growth. So look, I'd love to know a little bit more about your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in Minnesota, born in Illinois. Family is split between the two places, but I love startups just like you. And I think what intrigues me, last night we had an event called Fuck Up Nights here and sorry if you have to beep that, it might be too late, but we did that yesterday. We had Fuck Up Nights last night, and one of our founders that was telling his stories of professional failure mentioned, he said, you can either be in the Navy or you're a pirate, and entrepreneurs are more like pirates. And that resonated with me in more ways than I can count. So I actually come from startups, so I was raised in an entrepreneurial family. And I founded my first marketing consulting firm, back 10 years ago, here in Minnesota, working with some creative founders and entrepreneurs, dance studios, hat makers, things that interested me when I was 20-something. And helping them get their products and services out. So I've always had it in me. I was raised around it. And then I started working with startups here in Minnesota as a result of working in marketing. So helping different startups and entrepreneurs get their messages told and their stories straight, really so that it could land with the right audiences and they could build and develop their brand. So I've always worked in this space. 7 years ago, I had a little girl. We were talking about that backstage. So where I was involved in the startup ecosystem before, I went a little bit quiet to raise my daughter and settle with family. I was working with a lot of companies on the East Coast in PR. So doing marketing automation, software. I had a team of developers that I was working with through the PR firm that I founded. And we're affecting that change just at greater scales with bigger companies. And it was really interesting, scrappy work in some ways, and then polished work on the outside, of course. And so have always had that entrepreneurial spirit, but I like the way that Minnesota founders bring things to life, right? Steve Grove, the commissioner of Deed, talks about how we're the problem-solving capital of the nation, if not the world. And I really do think that's true. And so that's a lot of what's kept me here. Full transparency, I was on my way out for a move to New York before Beta approached me with this great opportunity to plug into and serve the startup ecosystem here.
We're glad you stayed.
Me too. Me too. Thank you. And this week has been a testament to the spirit and the kindness and the collaboration of the people that are here. So I can't thank you all enough for showing up for each other and showing your best. Yeah, it is a really incredible place to build. So
yes.
That's why I decided to stay.
Yeah.
So long story longer.
A good story, though.
Thanks.
Very much.
It's an incredibly connected ecosystem, and there are people who are working together to solve important problems. Yeah. But of course, those folks that need that help need access to capital and access to resources. And so with our topic, our theme of developing an equitable ecosystem, that's really what we want to get into today.
Yeah, definitely.
So in addition to being managing partner at Generator, you're also managing partner at the MSP Equity Fund, and I want to get into that work.
Sure.
So how are you, first let's talk about the problem. What problem does the Equity Fund seek to solve? And then we'll get into the data a little bit later.
We'll talk. I can talk a little bit about the data right now as well. And so these are some statistics you may have heard before. But when looking at the landscape of investment and venture capital, it's quite dismal and I think quite disappointing, given all the years of work that have went into it. We still see that just 1% of all U.S. Venture capital is invested in black entrepreneurs, 1.8% in Latinx, 3% into women, and less than 1% into women of color. Less than 1%. When you look at the statistics in Minnesota, however, it gets worse. Those were national statistics. So when you're looking at Minnesota, you have to ratchet that down a bit. So when talking about why we really sought to structure the MSP Equity Fund like we have, one of the reasons was looking at this dismal landscape of venture capital. How can we get capital into the hands in Minnesota of the founders that need it most? In addition, so the MSP Equity Fund is a venture capital fund of funds structure that would invest 100% into diverse founders in the state of Minnesota. So when thinking about how we could drive regional economic growth and impact, and also get dollars into the hands of the entrepreneurs, not in California, not in New York, not in Massachusetts, but the entrepreneurs here, the wonderful entrepreneurs here, diverse entrepreneurs here that are struggling to raise capital, we thought this structure was the best way to do it. Also, there's another layer. With a fund of funds, of course, you're investing into funds. And so looking at the fund structure and how funds are raised, we saw that BIPOC and women fund managers were struggling with capital across the country. When raising their first funds, they were taking typically 6 months to a year longer, and those funds tended to be 30 to 50% less than their white counterparts. So here we have another challenge of how we solve for fund managers, getting this access to the fund managers so that they can invest in the best businesses, including businesses that people who look like them, right? We know that black entrepreneurs will invest in black entrepreneurs often and others, but they tend to invest more in black entrepreneurs, and the same with women. So that creating that effect, it was very important when looking at the structure of the MSP Equity Fund.
That's really fascinating work. So, fund of fun,
Yeah.
it's an interesting way to do it. Is there anything else like that that exists in the region, or is it kind of the first of its kind here?
No, there are other regional fund of funds across the country, in Michigan, Houston, Illinois, and other areas of the United States, and that have been very successful. This would be the first fund of funds that would invest into race, place, and gender. But there are other regional fund of funds that are models and have been successful in driving regional economic growth. And I think that's important to note that those funds have had huge impacts on the region's economic growth, including serving as pipelines for innovation for corporations. And so with our thriving corporate community here, they'll need pipelines of innovation as we go forward. We know, you know this very well, is that the founders of the last 20 years will look very different than the founders we'll see the next 20 years. And we have to have pipelines of innovation and ways to support those founders here.
Yeah, we definitely do. We definitely do. So that's incredibly important work. And something that we're doing, and a lot of the research, of course, that you've presented, this data that you've presented, is something that we've taken a look at Beta and Twin Cities Startup Week as a platform for the community to get programs just like this one out to the general public, right? We want to make sure that there's awareness built and that everyone has a platform to share what they're doing to build and grow this ecosystem. When we consider that, that's really our place in the ecosystem is Twin Cities Startup Week as an organization. Something that we've decided to launch this year for the first time ever, right? Awesome. I know, is something that's very parallel to what you're working on at the Equity Fund, and that is the Twin Cities Startup Week Equity Pledge. So the Equity Pledge is in part in response to Clockwork's Diversity Pledge, which launched back in 2015 and was focused on diverse candidates in tech. It delivered some really important and critical results for the way that companies were aware of the problem that existed and who they were hiring. And it was a way for companies to, place a badge on their websites and say, we recognize there's a problem. We're committed to changing the way that we hire, changing our hiring practices.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and being more equitable in the way that we're seeking talent acquisition. That was a really great program. What we recognized and it still exists. So a big round of applause for Clockwork for bringing that to life.
Yeah.
what we recognized this year is that something that affects access to capital, but also access to resources and relationships is the way that we storytell as a region. And the way that we, as leaders who are responsible for delivering resources to the community, delivering resources to founders, and really determining who has access to those resources. Well, we've solved for programs, great programs that are available through LaunchMN and great programs that are available through different ESOs. The awareness is something we know we could all work on together. And so that's why this equity pledge is really important to us. So we've partnered with a local DEI firm. And this is part of the goal of this conversation is to talk about how these two programs work together. We've partnered with a local DEI firm that we'll be announcing later this year to deliver a cohort to the community of 25 ecosystem leaders from different funds and government programs and ESOs, nonprofit organizations, people who are really lifting up entrepreneurs in this community, to help take a look at this data to distribute resources in a more equitable way. So where we've definitely solved for access to capital as it exists with funds, we're looking at the messaging and the awareness and the access and the distribution with the equity pledge. So we're really pleased to roll it out here at Twin Cities Startup Week. We're really pleased with the outcomes, of course, that the Equity Fund is delivering, and then what we know this program can deliver over time as cohorts go through each year to learn more about what's affected the way that capital is distributed and resources are distributed here, and then what we can do about it. And so together as leaders, we'll come up with that thesis and continue to deliver on our goals.
I think that awareness is important. We often talk about, and I'm sure you've heard this quite a bit this week about BIPOC and women entrepreneurs being over-mentored and underfunded.
So many times.
Yeah, we've heard that, right? We heard it over and over, but it's true. Yeah. It's very much true. And so I think you have to solve for the capital issues, but also the awareness as well. And so I think that is an absolute great initiative that will do a lot in this ecosystem.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. So a question, I think for both of us probably.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
It's not light work, of course, when we're thinking about ways to be equitable. It's not light work when we think about the historical context that is involved when we're trying to correct systems that have historically marginalized people who definitely deserve to be at the table. And so when we consider this work, how do you keep your spirits up? So this is more of a personal question. We've talked about the programs, but how do you keep your spirits up when we're doing this work?
It can be tough. It definitely can be tough. I'm a generally positive person, so I'm a glass half full individual, so I see the world that way often. And so I try to keep that positive attitude, but even, at times it's tough. So I try to stay centered and take time for myself to work out. Take that time every day when I have it to maybe meditate and step back. As I mentioned to you, I'm a basketball coach, so I spend a lot of time in the gym. And so that is my time to decompress, relax, give back, and enjoy. And it recenters me a lot of times. And so I think it's important for leaders, regardless of the industry, to have things outside of your work that you do that center you and that you really enjoy. How about yourself? I'm curious, that question about you. What do you do to stay centered? I know you've done, like this week has been incredibly busy for you. And you've done such a great job, but how do you maintain that personal Shelisa? How do you get back to center when doing all these activities and leading this organization?
Yeah, definitely. Of course, it's my first year in the organization, and it's a different kind of schedule and a lot more in person for all of us since being out the last few years. I love to spend time outdoors. The Twin Cities has such a great outdoor. Okay, we had a technical difficulty. I think we're fine. The Twin Cities has such a great, there are so many great resources here for us to enjoy. And so that's how I really reset. I go out and walk. I've got friends in the audience who walk with me often and hike. But I also think it's important to take a look at what's happening around the country. And so I do read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I guess you could kind of consider that some of the work. Otherwise, I really love to dance. Candidly, I love to dance. But let's get back into
Yes.
get back into our topic of equity. So, for a founder that's struggling to identify what resources might be a fit for them, if they're seeking capital, how would they get involved? Are you able to tell us anything about how they would get involved in the funds that you're funding through the equity fund?
Yeah. I would say, my general advice is when to be creative. I would think when looking for funding. I was on a call, actually a panel on Monday, and one of the things I talked about is that there are so many different types of funding. It can make your head spin. Venture capital is only one type of funding. There's 10 areas of funding under that rubric. So I think for founders, what I often like to talk about is really understanding your model, your business, and really understand why you're raising money. Okay, and have a quantitative analysis and looking at how much money you need and how that would impact your business. And so I think that's important to really, when thinking about funding, don't get overly focused on one type of funding. We hear a lot about venture capital for a number of different reasons, but there's other types of funding out there. There's revenue-based financing for some types of businesses. There's peer-to-peer lending. There's all types of funding. So I would say be creative. And also talk to people who are founders who have raised capital. I think those lessons learned are very important, and they can save you from going down some pitfalls that you could possibly have in the future.
Excellent. Is there a single resource, websites that you would recommend? I know Forge North has really great resources. We've got Forge North here too, but we would mention you even if you weren't because of the quality. Where would you suggest founders go to find the information they might need?
Yeah, I love Forge North. Shout out to Forge North. I think that work is really important, and that's, getting involved in Forge North and some founders and others who are involved in that organization is one, I think that's quite critical. So that's one of my favorite organizations.
Mine too.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about outcomes. So should the MSP Equity Fund accomplish exactly what it's intended to, what would Minnesota look like if you delivered on everything that you hope for?
Wow. That's a big one. The long-term goal is for Minnesota to be a destination for Black, brown, and women entrepreneurs, a place where these entrepreneurs feel welcome, part of the community, and are well-funded, and are well-connected in a variety of social networks. That's the goal. I think we're a long way off from that for a number of different reasons. Thank you for inviting me to the event at Soul Bowl. I had an opportunity to speak with a local entrepreneur there who is raising capital, has raised quite a bit of capital, $0 from firms in Minnesota, but raising capital, right? And so these are the type of stories that we have. We have African-American entrepreneurs, we have Latinx entrepreneurs here that we're going to lose if we don't solve these problems. I mean, he frankly looked me in the eye and said, hey, I'm close to leaving and going to Texas. And so it's really important that we solve these challenges. And it's not, it's a thing of we, all of us, together. And that's why, I talk about Forge North is because that's a place where I think we can all, as business people, but also as neighbors and problem solvers, get together under an umbrella and sit down and talk about these tough challenges and how we can solve them.
That's so powerful. So powerful. And I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I love what you said about making this a destination.
Yeah.
That's really, of course, what we're trying to accomplish with a week like this and bringing the community together. There's so much support, and there really are so many resources. But it is that awareness, of course, of incredible funds like yours. That will drive and keep people here.
Yeah, I'd be curious as well, when you're thinking about the impact of beta, and that long-term impact. How do you see that in terms of equity?
Sure. So something that we've gotten to the habit of saying amongst our team this year is that we're the front door and the firm handshake, the warm hug of Minnesota's startup ecosystem at Beta. And that's what we intend to continue to be. The challenge for us, and really what we get to dig into this year and in years going forward, is how do we invite more people through that front door? How do we invite more people to experience what's happening and why this is a place that fosters so much innovation? And so answering those questions and then building the awareness around that. We've done some things this year to get more people from the community involved. For instance, we started a steering committee. And shout out to our steering committee members for Twin Cities Startup Week of this year. For those who are in the audience today, started a steering committee. So it's getting more voices involved to understand what the needs are in different communities in order to build that awareness and keep the door open, of course, and invite more people in. So we recognize that the more communities that are already existing in Minnesota, where innovation is happening, where people are building companies, and where people have needs for access to these resources, to capital, and to relationships, we recognize that that's the unique problem that we can solve, is really being that platform for resource providers, and then being that plug for the people who are looking. So if we delivered on everything, in the time that I'm here, I'm the 4th executive director, and then the first woman of color to run the organization, which is, yes. Thank you. Thank you. We've had a lot of perspective shift this year, and I see it as a continuum. It's been an honor to step into this role, and it's very evident that a lot of incredibly talented people have taken this organization as far as they possibly can. And so to stand as next in line in that legacy, to drive this as far as we possibly can, and invite as many founders and entrepreneurs and developers and technologists and just good people in the ecosystem to create and to continue to build and invite people in, that's the honor of a lifetime. So when we deliver, it looks like a really big table. That looks like the world, that looks like our community, and companies that are thriving and surviving and staying here is really the goal. So you talk about a destination, and we talk about a home. Yeah, definitely.
I think, there's, I had a chance to talk to some folks in the Cincinnati ecosystem recently, and, one of the things they talked about was collaboration. And there's a collaboration among the actors in their ecosystem, very intentional about how they're looking at equity and how they're building programming. So that, destination, a home, so they can build that in that particular region. Of course, access to capital was a topic of conversation, but it was also that collaboration that I think is also important for actors in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. So I'm very glad that we get to collaborate, that we get to share this stage today.
It's amazing.
What we want to do with the rest of the time is just open it up for questions about access to capital in Minnesota, because that's a big part of us being equitable, and then, of course, questions about awareness and how we're building this community. So we'll open it up now for audience questions.
Hi, I think it's amazing that you've got the fund of funds, and that Tundra and Brown have these, VCs. I'm wondering about how we solve for that entrepreneur who is never going to develop like the high-risk, high-reward company, and there's a need for funding there because they can really build organizations or companies that can, a CPG that can be all over target, but still wouldn't be appropriate for venture capital. So how can we start to fund those companies? And full disclosure, I'm with Connect Up, so we have a fund, but we're also raising funds, and everybody wants to give to VC. So I'm curious as to what solutions you all have seen across the country or ideas people have.
Yeah, great question. I know a lot of people in our ecosystem currently are working to create ecosystem maps, and so there are a few of those happening. We've had a lot of conversations about that, but I think that the access to capital aspect of that specifically is possibly the most important one for those companies that might not be considered high growth or ultra high growth. Something that we're doing at Beta is creating directories. So of course, currently we have jobs boards for folks. I'm sorry, I'm blanking. I'm looking up into the light. But back to your question. So for entrepreneurs who might not be high growth, might not necessarily be tech startups, but the CPG who might be more of a small business, I would direct them to something like Greater MSP or something like Forge North for the ecosystem mapping that they're doing for the community already. In the meantime, before those resources are available, isn't that the problem that we're trying to solve together? And really what this equity pledge is intended to deliver is we see that there are a lot of different entrepreneurs involved in this community and a lot of good leaders of organizations with the resources, but how do we get those resources distributed and delivered? And so that's a lot of the work of this fund. So from Beta's perspective, that's really what we hope to contribute to the ecosystem and solve that problem.
I've been in discussions probably over the last year with a number of revenue-based financing funds that actually invest and work with CPG companies. And so I think that's an opportunity there. Those are there's not a ton of them doing the work, but a gentleman that was here actually for Twin Cities Startup Week has a model where he's looking at something of that nature. So I think to the extent we can attract those type of funds to Minnesota and bring their expertise, I think that helps out with the challenge that you're mentioning.
I have a question here. Thank you both for this great presentation, but also your willingness to grow the Twin Cities startup ecosystem. Question I have for both of you is, along the lines of venture capital and funding, is what would you say is the value of raising venture capital and why people do it as opposed to, you mentioned peer-to-peer lending or equity crowdfunding. What in addition to just money, right? Because there's a lot of money out here. What in addition to money is the value of venture capital?
That's a great question and good to see you. I think you're right. It's a lot of money for some entrepreneurs. I think there are some entrepreneurs where the doors just open up and the money comes in, and then others who are struggling to find that access to capital. But I think when you think about venture capital, you also think about the other things that comes with venture capital: the resources, the expertise, the connections. Who can that particular firm connect you with in the ecosystem who has done that work to help you advance as a business? I think that's really the most important. Those venture dollars, how are they going to advance you with that expertise that firm is bringing to the table? So I think that's where the bang for the buck is often when looking at venture.
I am excited to learn about the new initiative to bring in more voices to help us understand what's missing from the ecosystem. And so as part of that, I'm wondering, are the 25 members selected? Is there an opportunity for people to reach out and tell you, hey, I'd love to be part of this. I see myself in traditional venture capital. I don't see myself in traditional venture capital. I have a unique journey that I'd love to share to help other entrepreneurs. How do they participate?
Excellent question. So applications are open. We have an inquiry form. You go to twincitiesstartupweek.com/equity pledge. That's where you're able to submit the inquiry form, and then we will be going through a formal application process for those 25 members of the cohort this fall.
Hello. I'm a recent, I've had a business for quite a long time, but I wouldn't call myself a founder. I wouldn't call myself a CEO. Just a person who started a business, and it's been 10 years now working. But I have just recently built out a secondary project that just recently got funded. So I would call myself now a realistic founder. But in the course of the last 10, 12 years, I'd say that I've been to many of these different events, and across the country, and they tend to gear towards technology, very tech-driven. And one thing that I might ask for both of you is that I hear many people give generic sayings that we should change things and we should change things. Are there conversations with the states, the cities about changing the educational systems, about going into schools and saying, we aren't teaching any form of like business or foundational stepping stones to, let's say, an event like today where people are 18, 20, 25, 40, who've already gone through an educational process and are so far behind that it seems like that VC is the only place that we can go as a quick, I need the money now. And there's no almost pedigree in the process. And then layers upon layers of different diversities and many different social dynamics come into play. And it seems like it's a pyramid system all over again. So if I have a question there, is there conversations about changing our communities from that perspective versus creating fantastic organization or events like what we're experiencing this week?
Yeah, I mean, what a visionary question. I think that's a really important thing for us to consider and for us to address. I know that there are certain organizations in the ecosystem that maybe have youth programs, if that's centered on entrepreneurship or if it's centered on technology. I don't believe that it's anything that we've necessarily had a concerted effort to address as a state or as Minneapolis, as the Twin Cities as an ecosystem, but it is something that's of interest. This year at Twin Cities Startup Week, we launched a Youth in Tech Day just to see how something like an entrepreneurial support organization like Beta appeals to youth and children, and it has yet to be determined. We'll try it again and see. It wasn't incredibly well attended, but I know that there's interest. I know that there's definitely interest, and so we need to determine determine what the best entry is. And so perhaps that's something that we take a look at as ecosystem leaders. Al, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree. I don't have a ton to add, but I know that for instance, Mary and Steve Grove have the Silicon North Stars mentoring program.
Incredible
that I had a
program.
chance to participate in this year. Was absolutely wonderful. And so high school students that are learning about entrepreneurship, venture capital, I think we need more of those programs at an early stage. And so that was 20, 25 students, and just absolutely fabulous. But to your point, I've not been involved or don't know about a more concerted effort across the state or ecosystem that addresses some of those challenges.
Great questions, discussion. I want to second Michelle's comment on looking for additional funding that's not venture capital, because there are a lot of great businesses that need that. But I have a question on the equity fund specifically, which is I'm curious if you considered, or maybe you have it, adding any other leverage points in terms of how the venture capitalists sort of analyze the opportunities. If they're thinking about employment or regional economic impact, or if there's anything additional that you feel like you could push for with an equity fund model to fund those businesses that have a little bit more of a soul and a conscience to them, as opposed to just get big, get acquired, give everybody a 20x return.
No, I think that's a good point. There are a number of different impact metrics that we will be looking at for those investments. So I think that's one way in which we're trying to ensure that investment has an impact from a regional economic perspective, from a race perspective, from a place perspective, and also from gender. Those will be things that are tracked from an investment perspective. But I totally get what you're saying. To fund some of those businesses that are doing good in the community. I think me as general partner, the role that I'll play is as a connector. And so to your point, it's probably my role to connect some of those businesses and know about those businesses and ensure that the funds that are investing into Minnesota, that those businesses are showcased in front and center.
Hello, sorry. My name is Walter Ribeiro. I come from central Minnesota, Wadena County. It's probably one of the most poor counties in Minnesota. Mine, that's one of the greatest agricultural producers in the United States. As a Latin entrepreneur, which I didn't know I was an entrepreneur till I figured out that, that nobody knew what was doing, but there was a problem that had to be solved. So I tried the conventional conservative channels of funding through the SBA and the local business and economic development. So the nepotism of those areas are unimaginable. So, so that's when I find out, wait a minute, I have to find another source of funding, which was great, because then I went to MIT, accelerators, etc. But the question here is, when you see those areas, the rural Minnesota, they are so depleted of funding, and there are so many opportunities there. What are you thinking? Because our mentality when you come to these megalopolis like New York or Minneapolis or St. Paul, we forget a little bit how the rural areas need capital. They have, because the federal government is sending a lot of funding there, but the nepotism and the difficulty of developing a good business plan, we don't have that problem so far because we rely on a lean canvas. So I have a lot of help from entities like IoT or even the Minnesota Cup. If it wasn't for them, for this tracking that I have to be here today, matter of fact, we were the semi-finalists in the Minnesota Cup 2022 with our project.
Congratulations.
We have the support of 3 municipalities in rural Minnesota, and we have many stakeholders just waiting for us to step up. So the question is, what is the plan to bring that capital to the one need the most and where the opportunities exist in the rural Minnesota? Thank you.
Yes, I like it. Race, place, and gender. And so we at Generator talk a lot about place. In the larger context, we talk about it in that, of course, 80% of venture capital goes to 3 states, none of which is the Midwest, right? And so we talk about place in that context, thinking that the Midwest is a hidden gem. However, in the Minnesota context, thinking about how we contextualize place is that we see the Twin Cities as centers of innovation often. But if we're talking about equity and having an equitable conversation, we certainly have to include greater Minnesota, right? And so that is something that I talk a lot about quite a bit, and with the fund, what we're building out is that it is not necessarily a Twin Cities phenomenon, but one that will look at the entire state and ensure that those opportunities are capitalized on all over the state, not just in the Twin Cities.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Well, I think that might conclude our discussion. Al, it was so nice to sit down with you to close out a very elevated and energized week at Twin Cities Startup Week. Do you have any parting notes for the audience?
I'd just like to thank you. This has been and team for an absolutely fabulous Twin Cities Startup Week. The program has been amazing. The energy has been wonderful. I am excited, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. Please stay with us today for the Minnesota Startup Awards that are happening next. And Al, I'm really excited about the work we get to effect together with the community. This has been great.
Let's collaborate.
All right, take care, everybody.
Thanks.